The folder was sitting right there on the closet floor, half hidden under a wool blanket my mother-in-law had owned since before I ever met her son. My daughter Zoe found it the way 6-year-olds find everything, by accident, by being somewhere she probably shouldn't have been, dragging out every blanket and box she could reach because she wanted to build a fort. She came running into the kitchen holding it over her head like a trophy. Red marker on the front, capital letters, the handwriting I had seen on birthday cards and grocery lists for 15 years. Tell Dad. Some people in my family still think what I did next was the wrong move. I need you to tell me if they're right. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what was inside that folder. I was not in that house because something had already gone wrong. I was there because it was a Sunday afternoon in October, and my husband Darian was helping his mother, Renata Ose, move some furniture into storage, and Zoe had begged to come along because she loved her grandmother's house and the way it smelled like cinnamon and old wood, and whatever candle Renata kept burning on the mantel. It was ordinary. That is what I keep coming back to. The light in the kitchen was the flat gray kind that comes through windows just before the afternoon decides to give up. Renata was somewhere in the back of the house with Darian, their voices low and methodical the way they get when they're doing a task together. I was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee I'd stopped actually drinking about 20 minutes before, just holding it, half listening to Zoe in the other room. Then she appeared in the doorway with the folder and her face was so open and pleased, so completely unaware of anything, and she said, "Mama, there's letters in here and someone wrote 'Don't tell Daddy.'" She handed it to me and went back to building her fort. I set down the coffee cup. I sat down at the kitchen table, and I opened it. Let me tell you how we got here. I met Darian Osai at 26, at a fundraiser for a children's literacy nonprofit that a colleague had dragged me to because the open bar was supposed to be exceptional. He was tall and quiet in the way that reads is confident at a party, and he laughed at something I said about the past appetizers, and that was more or less the entire beginning of everything. We dated for 2 years. We got married in a small ceremony in the Berkshires with 40 guests and a cake that was slightly lopsided and tasted like nothing wrong at all. We moved into a house in a suburb of Hartford that needed work, but had good bones and a backyard that caught the afternoon light in a way that felt like a promise. I was 30. He was 32. I was working as a purchasing manager for a mid-size regional logistics company, and he was 3 years into a position at a civil engineering firm in the city. I thought I knew what our life would look like. The first time I met Renata Osai, she took my hand in both of hers and looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable and said, "You're very pretty." It was not a compliment exactly. It was more like an appraisal. She was not unkind. She was just a woman who had strong ideas about what her son's life should contain, and she was measuring whether I qualified. I did not yet understand that I would spend the next decade trying to pass a test whose criteria she never disclosed. Darian's family was not large. His father had passed before I came into the picture, a man named Kofi whose photograph sat on the piano in the living room and who Darian spoke about with the specific tenderness of someone who had learned grief early and built their life carefully around it. Renata had raised Darian largely on her own after Kofi died, working double shifts for years as an administrator at a hospital network, and she had the particular pride of a woman who had done something hard and done it completely. She wore it quietly, but it was always there. I respected her. I genuinely did. What I didn't understand at the beginning was that the respect was not mutual, and that it wasn't going to become mutual simply because I worked for it. The first incident that I still think about happened 14 months into our marriage. Darian and I were at a Sunday dinner at Renata's house, the kind of dinner she hosted once a month without variation. A roast, vegetables she had spent the entire afternoon preparing, a dessert she had baked from a recipe she kept handwritten in a notebook she had owned since the 1980s. Her sister Claudette was there, a woman a few years younger than Renata who had the particular quality of agreeing loudly with whoever had the most authority in the room. I had just that week been offered a promotion, not a small one. It would mean managing a regional team, overseeing procurement across 4 states, and a salary increase of roughly $22,000 annually. I was excited in the way you are when something you worked for actually arrives, when the work wasn't hypothetical anymore. I mentioned it at dinner. I kept it brief. I said I had been offered a promotion and I was planning to take it. Renata put down her fork carefully. She asked what the role entailed. I told her. There was a pause. "You'll be traveling," she said. It wasn't a question. Some, I said, not extensively. When you have children, she said, that becomes more complicated. Claudette nodded in the way she always nodded. I said we didn't have children yet. Not yet, Renata said, and picked her fork back up. That night, I lay in bed listening to Darian breathe and made a decision that I didn't name out loud and didn't explain to anyone. I decided I was going to stop reporting my professional life at the dinner table, not because I was ashamed of it, because I understood that the table wasn't a place where my professional life would be received fairly, and I was not interested in offering things up to be diminished. I accepted the promotion the next morning. I didn't mention it again at Sunday dinner for 3 months. That was the beginning of what I can only describe as my private life. Not secret, exactly. Parallel. The thing about being underestimated by someone who sees you regularly is that it creates a very particular kind of pressure. You can feel it at every gathering, in the way a comment lands, in the questions that get asked and the ones that don't. Renata was never overtly cruel. That would have been easier to name. She was precise. She knew exactly where to apply the weight. The second incident was 2 years into the marriage, when Darian and I were seriously discussing buying a larger property. We had saved carefully. I had been promoted twice by that point and was making a salary that I kept to myself the way I had learned to keep most things. We found a property in a neighborhood we loved, a house with 4 bedrooms and a finished basement and a backyard that backed up to a small nature preserve. We went to look at it on a Saturday. Renata came because Darian had mentioned it to her and she had expressed interest, and Darian was, in this specific way, still the son of a woman who had raised him alone, which meant some boundaries were slower to form. She walked through the house with a measured expression. She touched the countertops. She looked at the backyard. Then she stood in the kitchen and said to me, in a tone that was almost kind, "This is a lot of house for where you two are right now." Darian was in the basement with the realtor. I looked at her. "Lionel," she said, "that's my name, Lionel Osei, nee Pharaoh. I just want you both to be realistic. Reaching too far too fast is how people end up in trouble." I smiled. I said, "We've thought it through pretty carefully." "Of course," she said, and the way she said it made clear she didn't believe that. What she didn't know, because I had not told Darian yet in a way that would reach his mother, was that I had been consulting with a financial advisor for 8 months at that point, and that our down payment was fully funded, and that based on the projections I had run with that advisor, we were not reaching at all. We were, if anything, buying conservatively. We made an offer the following Tuesday. It was accepted. I felt something settle in my chest when the call came. Not triumph, exactly. More like alignment. Like the world had confirmed something I already knew and hadn't been given credit for knowing. The like-trigger moment arrives here without announcement, because if you have ever stood in a room and smiled through someone's condescension, while already holding the answer they told you that you couldn't possibly have, you already know what that silence costs and what it buys. By the time Zoe was born, I had been with my company for 7 years and had moved into a director-level position overseeing procurement strategy for the entire Northeast region. It was not a glamorous title. It was not the kind of work that generated the specific awe that some professions do at dinner parties. But it was consequential work that I was genuinely good at, and it paid me accordingly, and I had built, over those years, a professional reputation that I was proud of in the quiet way I had learned to be proud of things. Renata held Zoe in the hospital the day after she was born, and in that moment, she was completely unguarded in a way I had never seen before. She held her and she looked at her, and there was something on her face that I recognized as pure love, uncomplicated, the kind that doesn't calculate. I filed that away. It mattered. I'll tell you why later. The third incident happened when Zoe was 18 months old. I had gone back to work full-time when she was 4 months old, which was a decision I had made deliberately and which I did not particularly want adjudicated. We had arranged reliable childcare. Darian's schedule had some flexibility that mine did not. The logistics were our logistics. At a Sunday dinner in April, Renata asked me, with Claudette present, whether I had thought about stepping back while Zoe was young. I looked at her. "Not in a permanent way," she said quickly. "Just while she's small, it goes so fast." Claudette nodded. She always nodded. "We're managing well," I said. "Of course," Renata said. "I just think a mother's presence at this age is something a child can feel. It's not something that can be replaced." There was a pause in which several things were available to me as responses, and I chose none of them. What I did instead, that evening, was call my attorney for the first time about something that had been forming at the edges of my thinking for almost 2 years. Her name was Adiz Enwasu, and she was sharp in a way that made most conversations feel like they were moving faster than they actually were. I had met her through a professional contact and retained her for some contract review work that had come up in my director role, and she had the quality I valued most in anyone I paid for expertise. She told me what was true, not what was comfortable. I told her what I had been thinking about. She listened. "Send me the documentation you have," she said, "and we'll talk about what's possible." That phone call was the beginning of the preparation, not the crisis, the preparation. The fourth incident is the one that closed the door on my uncertainty. Zoe was 3.5. She had started a preschool program 3 mornings a week that she loved with the uncomplicated totality that 3-year-olds love things. She talked about it at dinner and drew pictures of her teachers and came home smelling like craft glue and cheerfulness. She was, in every way I could observe, thriving. At Thanksgiving that year, the whole family gathered. Renata's house, the roast, Claudette, and a cousin of Darian's named Felix, who I had met twice and who was perfectly pleasant and mostly silent. It was a good evening, mostly. The food was exceptional. Zoe sat in a booster seat and ate approximately 14 dinner rolls and was delighted by all of it. After dinner, while the adults were sitting in the living room, Zoe came running in from the hallway with a toy she'd found in Renata's guest room, something left over from when Darian's nephews had visited the previous summer. She was excited. She held it up and said something to her grandmother in her 3-year-old voice, the words slightly tumbled, the sentence enthusiastic and perfectly clear to anyone paying attention. Renata looked at her, then looked at me and said, in a tone that was conversational, almost offhand, "She's a little behind with her language, isn't she?" The room did not go quiet. No one reacted visibly. Felix studied his dessert plate. Claudette looked toward the window. Darian said mildly, "She talks constantly, Mom." "I just mean developmentally," Renata said. "Some children are slower." Not a criticism. Zoe, 3.5, standing in the middle of the living room with her toy, had no idea what the word developmentally meant, but children that age read the room through something other than vocabulary. She looked at her grandmother's face and then she looked at mine, and she came and stood next to my chair. I put my hand on her back. I said, "She's exactly where she should be." My voice was level. My hand was completely still. What I did not do, I did not raise my voice. I did not create a scene in front of my daughter. I did not give Zoe the experience of watching her mother fight at a holiday table. What I did, the following Tuesday, I called Adiz and told her to move forward. I told her I was done waiting to be sure. I was sure. Zoe, for the record, had been assessed by her pediatrician 3 months prior. Her language development was in the 85th percentile for her age. I had that report in a folder at home. I had it memorized. The thing that drove everything, the thing that made the folder in Renata's closet hit with the specific weight it did, was something I had noticed very quietly over the years, and then confirmed 18 months before that Sunday afternoon in October. Darian and I had been trying to have a second child for 2 years before Zoe was born, and we had struggled. There were appointments and tests and a period of time that was difficult in the way those things are difficult, which is to say constantly and privately and in a way that most people around you cannot see. We had eventually looked at other options. We had explored them together. And we had made a decision that was ours alone, or that I believed was ours alone. What was in the folder was an adoption packet. Originals. Notarized. Dated from a period that should not have been possible without my signature, which I had provided willingly, which was there. But also in the folder was a second set of documents. Older, sealed envelope. My husband's name on the front in Renata's handwriting, and below his name, in smaller letters, and Lionel's, if she signs. I sat at the kitchen table with the folder open in front of me. I could hear Darian's voice from somewhere in the back of the house, easy and unhurried, helping his mother move things from one place to another. I could hear Zoe in the living room, happily constructing her fort. I looked at the documents for a long time. The sealed envelope was still sealed. 15 years of sealed, the flaps slightly yellowed at the edge. Whatever was inside had been placed there before Darian and I met, before I existed in this family's story. I opened it. The papers inside were folded in thirds. Legal document weight. I recognized the format because I had signed documents in this format before, during the adoption process, when everything had been above board and presented to me in an attorney's office with full disclosure. These were not those papers. These were earlier papers. These were papers from a process that had been completed before Darian ever mentioned adoption to me, before the fertility struggles, before any of the conversations I believed were the beginning. My daughter Zoe had been placed in a process that had begun before I was part of the decision. My hands were steady. I have thought about that since. I do not know what it says about me that my hands were steady. Maybe that I had been preparing, without knowing exactly what I was preparing for a very long time. I was refolding the documents back into the envelope when I heard the footsteps in the hallway. And then the doorbell rang. And Renata's front door opened, because it was Renata's house and no one knocked, and I heard a voice I did not recognize say words I did not immediately process. And then I heard Darian's voice from the back of the house change, in a way that voices change when something has gone wrong. The police arrived. The officer at the door was young, maybe mid-20s, with the particular posture of someone who had been trained to look calm and had not yet had enough years on the job to feel it. Behind him was a second officer, older, a woman with her hand resting on her belt in a way that was habitual rather than threatening. They asked if this was the residence of Renata Osei. I was still at the kitchen table. I had maybe 4 seconds before Darian came down the hallway, and I used those 4 seconds to slide the adoption papers back into the folder, the sealed envelope on top, and I placed the folder on the chair beside me with my cardigan over it. Not hidden, just not visible. Darian appeared from the hallway, Renata 1 step behind him, and his face did the thing it does when he's processing something he doesn't yet have a category for, a very slight stillness, like a clock between ticks. The younger officer asked if they could come inside. What followed was the kind of conversation that happens in a specific register, the one that is police formal and family panicked at the same time, and the information that came out of it in pieces over the next 20 minutes was this. Someone had filed a report. A neighbor, as it turned out, a woman named Dolores Vanthorpe, who lived 3 houses down and who had apparently called the non-emergency line 2 days prior with concerns about activity at Renata's house. There had been a series of visits from an individual Dolores had described as a young man she didn't recognize. She had seen him twice in the driveway and once at the back gate. She had not said anything to Renata directly because, as she apparently told the dispatcher, she didn't want to cause trouble, she just wanted someone official to know. The officers were doing a welfare check. That was the word they used. Welfare. Renata stood in her own living room and received this information with a dignity that I recognized as the specific kind that comes from having survived things that would have leveled other people. She thanked them. She told them she was fine. She said she had no idea who Dolores had seen and that she would pay more attention to who was coming and going near her property. The older officer gave her a card. The younger one looked at Zoe, who had materialized in the doorway of the living room at some point with a blanket from her fort draped around her shoulders like a cape, and he said, "Cool blanket." Zoe looked at him with the gravity of someone who has been told something she already knew. "It's a cape," she said. He said that was better. They left, the door closed. Renata's hands, which had been clasped in front of her the entire time, unclenched, and Darian looked at his mother and said, "Mom, who's been coming to the house?" The question landed in the room and sat there. Renata turned toward the kitchen, toward where I was still sitting at the table, and for one moment her eyes went to the chair beside me, to the cardigan that covered the folder, and then she looked at my face, and I looked back at hers, and neither of us said anything at all. What I understood in that moment, reading her face the way you learn to read a face after 15 years, she knew I had found it. She had seen the folder on the chair. She recognized the configuration of things, the way you recognize your own handwriting from across a room. She turned back to Darian. "No one you need to worry about," she said. "An old acquaintance, I'll handle it." Darian accepted this the way he sometimes accepted things from his mother, not quite believing it, but filing it for later, unwilling to press in front of an audience. I picked up my cardigan and folded it over my arm. The folder was underneath it. I said I was going to get Zoe's things together because she was probably getting tired. No one stopped me. I did not bring the folder up that night. I did not bring it up the next morning or the morning after that. I was not being passive. I was thinking, which for me has always required physical space between the thought and the conversation, and what I needed to think through was not simple. Here is what I knew by the time we drove home from Renata's house that Sunday. My daughter's adoption had involved documentation that predated conversations I believed were the beginning of the process. There was a sealed envelope addressed jointly to Darian and to me, and specifically noting my signature as conditional, that had been sitting in Renata's closet for the entirety of my marriage. The police showing up on the same afternoon was either coincidence or it wasn't, and I did not yet know which. Here is what I did not know: what was in the original sealed envelope beyond what I had skimmed before the doorbell rang. I had not had time to read it fully. I had seen enough to understand its shape, but not all of its contents. I needed Adiz. I called her Monday morning from my car in the parking garage at work before I went upstairs. I told her the short version, the parts that mattered structurally. There was a pause on her end that I recognized as her doing what she did, which was taking information and immediately sorting it into categories of urgency. "Bring me the documents," she said. "Don't discuss this with your husband yet. Not because he's necessarily part of the problem, but because until you know what you're holding, you need to know what you're holding." "I know what I'm holding," I said. "You know what you saw in 4 seconds," she said. "Bring me the documents." I brought her the documents. The preparation had not started that Monday, though. That was just the moment it accelerated. The preparation had started 3 years earlier, quietly, in the specific way that things start when you haven't yet admitted to yourself that you've already made a decision. After the Thanksgiving, when Renata commented on Zoe's language development, after I had put my hand on my daughter's back and kept my voice level and called Adiz the following Tuesday, I had begun to build something. Not out of spite. Not out of revenge. Out of the recognition that I had been operating inside a structure that had never fully included me, and that I needed to understand my own position in it with precision. The structure was the Osei family's financial and property arrangements, which were more complex than Darian had ever explained in full, partly because men who grow up with mothers like Renata sometimes absorb the assumption that the family finances are the family matriarch's domain and not a matter for full disclosure. And partly because I had not, in the early years of our marriage, pushed for full disclosure the way I should have. What I knew, there was a family property trust that Kofi Osei had established before his death, which had been administered by Renata since Darian was 17. The trust held the original family home, a modest investment property in a neighboring town, and a portion of Kofi's life insurance proceeds that had been reinvested. Darian had an interest in that trust. What the precise terms of that interest were, and what Renata's administrative authority actually covered, I had never seen in writing. What I did not know, until I started finding out, the trust had been amended twice. Once when Darian turned 30, once 14 months before Zoe was born. The second amendment was the one that mattered. My professional life had continued in the direction it had been moving. 2.5 years before that October Sunday, I had been approached about a consulting arrangement by a former colleague who had moved into an independent procurement advisory practice and was building out her client roster. Her name was Ingrid Tamboli, and she was meticulous and direct and had a reputation in regional logistics circles that preceded her by about 15 years. The arrangement she offered me was not what I expected. It was not a side project or a weekend engagement. It was a serious proposal for a partnership stake in her practice, structured to keep my primary employment intact for the first 2 years while I built client relationships that would allow a clean transition. She had done the financial modeling. The projections for a 3-year horizon were, on paper, significant enough that I read the document twice and then set it down and took a walk around the block before reading it a third time. I kept it private because I was not ready for it to be a conversation. My income was mine. My professional life was mine. I had learned over the years of Sunday dinners and measured comments that the things I kept to myself stayed whole in a way that the things I offered for other people's assessment did not. That was all the reason I needed. I signed the partnership agreement on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room in Ingrid's office building. She slid the pen across the table. I signed. She signed. We shook hands. "We are going to do well," she said, with the flat certainty of someone reporting a weather pattern. I believed her. I was right to. The first close call came 8 months into the partnership. It was a Sunday dinner, late spring, the kind of evening that would have been pleasant if I had not been carrying the particular weight of a secret that was starting to require active management. Darian had mentioned to Renata, offhandedly, that I had been working late more than usual, framing it as mild curiosity rather than complaint, but framing has a way of being received regardless of intent. Renata waited until we were at the table, the 4 of us. Claudette had a prior engagement, which was the only piece of luck that evening, and she looked at me with the particular focus she reserved for things she intended to finish. "Darian says you've been putting in long evenings," she said. Is everything all right at work? It's a busy quarter, I said. It'll level out. She set her fork down with a precision that was almost theatrical. You know, when Kofi was still with us, he worked those kinds of hours for about 4 years straight. I used to tell him the company will still be there tomorrow. He used to say, but the opportunity won't. She paused. I always thought that was the wrong way to look at it. She was not asking about my schedule. She was asking me to confirm, in front of Darian, that I agreed with her philosophy, that the opportunity was less important than the presence. That I shared her values about what a wife and mother should prioritize. I picked up my water glass. That's an interesting way Kofi put it. I took a sip. What was the company he worked for at that point? It was a simple redirect. But it worked because Renata loved talking about Kofi, and because the question was genuine, I didn't know the answer. And because it was easier for her to accept a subject change, she had initiated the direction of then to acknowledge she'd been redirected. She talked about Kofi for the next 12 minutes. That night from the car on the way home, I called Ingrid and told her the Delacroix account was mine if she wanted to move forward on it. We had been debating the timing. Let's move, I said. She said, good, I'll send the contract in the morning. The Delacroix account was the largest we had taken on to that point. It tripled our visibility in the regional market in a single quarter. The second close call was harder. It was 14 months into the partnership, at a birthday dinner for Darian's cousin Felix, who had gotten quietly married the previous year and whose wife, a composed and watchful woman named Cressida, I liked immediately and instinctively in the way you like people who are also observing more than they're saying. Renata had, at some point during the preceding week, spoken with a woman she knew through her hospital network who had apparently mentioned my name in a professional context. Renata brought this up at the dinner table with the careful casualness of someone who had been waiting for the right moment. I ran into Bev Ockhafer, she said, addressing Darian more than me. She mentioned she'd heard Lionel's name come up in connection with some consulting group. Darian turned to look at me. His expression was open, curious, not suspicious, just interested in a fact he apparently didn't have. The table was Felix, Cressida, Renata, Darian, and Zoe, who was 4 at this point and deeply invested in her bread roll and not in the adult conversation. Bev knows a lot of people, I said, which was not an answer, and everyone at the table knew it wasn't an answer. Cressida looked at her plate. Felix looked at his wife. Renata's chin lifted slightly. She seemed to think it was going well, Renata said. Whatever it is. What was available to me in that moment, I could have explained. I could have named the practice, described the partnership, laid out the numbers in a way that would have satisfied the question and perhaps adjusted certain assumptions that had calcified over years of Sunday dinners. I had the information. I could have opened the door. I chose not to, not because I was afraid of the reaction. Because I had looked at Renata's face when she said whatever it is, and I had heard the particular register in which she said it. Not curious, not warm, but probing. The tone of someone who suspects they have been excluded from information they believe they have a right to. And I understood that this was not a safe table for that conversation. More to the point, Adiz had begun the process of reviewing the trust documents I had finally obtained through a records request that she had helped me structure, and we were in the middle of something that required me to be precisely where I was, present, calm, and not yet declared. I've done some project work through a colleague, I said. Nothing dramatic. Bev has a tendency to amplify things. Renata absorbed this. She does, she said, and took a sip of her wine. Cressida met my eyes across the table for half a second, and in that half second, there was a communication between us that required no words and which I have thought about since with something close to gratitude. That week, Adiz called me with what she had found in the trust amendment from 14 months before Zoe was born. Lionel, she said, and her voice had the particular quality it took on when she was about to tell me something she wanted to make sure I was sitting down for. The amendment includes a clause about adopted children and inheritance standing. It's written in a way that is, I want to use the right word here, discretionary. It gives the trustee the authority to determine whether an adopted child qualifies for full inheritance standing under the trust. The trustee being Renata, I said. The trustee being Renata, she confirmed. I sat with that for a moment. When was this added? 3 years before you adopted Zoe, she said. 14 months before Zoe was placed. The silence on the line was mine to fill, and I didn't fill it for a long time. All right, I said finally. What do we do with it? We document everything, Adiz said. We verify Zoe's legal standing under every applicable statute, which I already believe is solid regardless of the trust language. And then we build a case that makes the discretionary clause irrelevant. How long? If you give me what I need, she said. 18 months, maybe less. I said, tell me what you need. The third close call was the one that came closest to blowing everything open before I was ready. It was 6 months before that October Sunday, and it happened not at a dinner table, but at Zoe's school spring performance, the kind of event that fills a school gymnasium with folding chairs and phone cameras and a warmth that has nothing to do with temperature. Zoe was in the front row of her class group. She was 5.5, and she knew 3 of the 4 songs they were performing, and she was deeply uncertain about the 4th, which I knew because she had told me privately that she was going to just move her mouth for that one, and I had told her that was a completely professional approach, and she had accepted this with the seriousness it deserved. Renata was there. She always came to Zoe's school events, and I had never tried to prevent this because whatever Renata's complexities were as a mother-in-law, she loved my daughter with a completeness that I could not and did not want to discount. We were sitting in a row, Darian, Renata, me, when Renata leaned across Darian and said, close enough that only I could hear, I heard back from Franklin about the trust review. Franklin Ibarra was the attorney who had administered Kofi's estate and who continued to serve as the trust's outside counsel. I had never met him. I had only recently learned his name. My eyes stayed on the stage, where a teacher was adjusting a microphone stand. He thinks it may be worth updating some of the language, Renata said. Given the family situation. Given the family situation. I turned that phrase over carefully, the way you turn a stone to see what's underneath. That sounds like a conversation for you and Darian, I said, keeping my voice at the low register of the room. I wanted you to know, she said, that we want Zoe to be taken care of. That has always been our intention. She leaned back. The performance started. Zoe appeared in the front row and immediately found me in the audience with the accuracy of a homing signal, and she grinned with her whole face, and I smiled back with mine. And for the duration of the performance, that was the only thing that mattered. But on the drive home, with Zoe asleep in the backseat and Darian quiet beside me in the way he sometimes was after family events, I ran the phrase back through my mind. Given the family situation. Franklin Ibarra was being asked to update the trust language. Not after I had raised any concerns, not after any legal proceeding, proactively, before I had made a single formal move. Someone had told Renata that the existing language might not hold. The only people who knew I had been reviewing the trust documents were Adiz and me. I called Adiz the next morning from my car. Is there any possibility, I said, that the review process flagged on their end? A pause. There's always a possibility that a records request draws attention, especially on a trust that has active outside counsel. Franklin Ibarra, I said, another pause, I'll make some calls. Adiz, I waited. How close are we? Her answer was precise and unhesitating, which was why I had kept her for 6 years. Close enough that I would not wait longer than 60 days. Everything I need from you, I have. What I'm finishing is the analysis of the original placement paperwork, the pre-conversation documents you brought me from Renata's house. That changes the shape of what we're building. In what direction? In the direction, she said carefully, of a conversation that cannot be had privately. That has to be had on the record. I understood what she meant. I had understood it in some part of myself since the afternoon I sat at Renata's kitchen table with a folder under my cardigan and listened to 2 police officers ask if everything was all right. Then let's finish it, I said. Adiz called me on a Wednesday morning in October, 3 weeks before the Sunday I've described, while I was in a meeting I had to step out of. I stood in the hallway outside the conference room with my hand against the wall and listened to her tell me that the analysis was complete. That Zoe's legal standing was unassailable, and that the trust language, while clearly intended to create discretionary authority, had been drafted in a way that Adiz described as ambitious rather than airtight. That we had documentation of the pre-placement process that raised questions about disclosure that would need to be answered, not by me, and not in a living room, but formally. We are ready, she said, whenever you decide to move. I said I needed 1 more week. She asked why. I looked down the hallway at the conference room door, at the light coming through the narrow window in it, at my own reflection partial and composed in the glass. Because I need to tell my husband before anyone else, I said. and I need to find the right moment. Adiz said, understood. I found the folder in Renata's closet 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon in October, and I did not get the chance to choose my moment because the police arrived first, and then something happened that I had not built a plan for. I want to know if you would have said what I said next, because I still think about it. The police visit resolved itself the way welfare checks resolve when the person being checked on is composed and cooperative and gives the officers no reason to stay. They left. The door closed. The afternoon reconstituted itself around us with the particular fragility of something that has been briefly shaken and not yet confirmed to be intact. Darian did not press his mother further about the visitor Dolores Vanthorpe had reported. He had the quality, which I had observed for 15 years, of deciding internally that certain conversations with Renata were better had privately, later, without an audience. It was not weakness. It was a learned behavior from a childhood I had not been part of, a calibration of when to push and when to wait that he had developed long before I existed in his life. I understood it. I had simply reached the end of my patience with what it cost. We stayed another hour. Zoe finished her fort, dismantled it with equal enthusiasm, ate a snack at Renata's kitchen table, and fell asleep in the car before we reached the end of the block. Darian drove. I sat in the passenger seat with the folder on my lap under my cardigan and watched the suburban streets unreal past the window and said almost nothing, which Darian attributed to tiredness, because that was the easiest attribution and because he was not yet looking for another one. I had been waiting for the right moment to tell him. The right moment did not come that week, because Darian traveled for work Monday through Wednesday, and the kind of conversation I needed to have with him was not a phone call. It was a kitchen table at 10 in the evening with no one else in the house. It also did not come that week because on Tuesday morning, while Darian was in a hotel room in Columbus, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered it, the voice on the other end was one I had never heard before, and it said, "Mrs. Osei, my name is Tobias Fenley. I'm an attorney. I represent a party with an interest in the Osei Family Trust, and I was hoping we could speak." I was in the parking garage. I did not go upstairs. "What party?" I said, a pause that was calibrated long enough to suggest significance, short enough to maintain control. I'm not in a position to disclose that in an initial call. I wanted to make contact first to understand if you were aware of certain recent developments. "What developments?" "There has been a filing," he said, "related to the trust instrument. A petition to clarify the standing of certain beneficiaries. I believe you would want to know about this before it proceeds further." I held the phone and looked at the concrete pillar in front of me. Someone had scratched their initials into it at some point, 2 letters I didn't register. "Mr. Fenley," I said, "I'm going to give you the name of my attorney. Please direct anything further to her." I gave him Adiz's name and number and ended the call. Then I called Adiz. She picked up on the second ring. "I was about to call you," she said. "Tobias Fenley." "Yes." Her voice had the particular flatness it took on when she was already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. "He filed a petition on Friday. I received notice this morning. Someone is attempting to formalize the discretionary language in the trust to get a court to affirm that the trustee has standing to determine inheritance eligibility for adopted children on a case-by-case basis." The words were precise, and their meaning was not difficult to parse. "Zoe," I said. "This is about Zoe's inheritance standing under Kofi's trust," Adiz confirmed. "Lionel, this is the escalation we were anticipating. They moved first." I sat with that for a moment. The parking garage was quiet except for the distant mechanical sound of a car on a level above me. "Who retained Fenley?" I said. "The petition lists the petitioner as the trustee acting in her administrative capacity. Renata filed this herself, 3 weeks before the Sunday at her house." Which meant she had filed the petition, and then I had found the folder, and then the police had arrived, and the entire afternoon had been a series of collisions between the thing I had been building and the thing she had already set in motion. "Adiz," I said, "we said 60 days. I know. We need to move now." Her response was immediate and without qualification. "I'll file the counterpetition today. And I'm going to reach out to Franklin Ibarra's office. He needs to understand that his client has created a significant exposure here and that he should advise her accordingly." "What exposure?" "The pre-placement documents," she said. "The ones from Renata's folder, the timeline they establish. If those documents show that Renata was involved in the placement process before Darian disclosed it to you, before you were part of that decision in the way you believed you were. Then we have a disclosure question that goes beyond the trust and into the adoption itself. Not into Zoe's standing, which is iron, into how the decision was made, who knew what and when. I said, "File everything." She said, "I'll call you this afternoon." I went upstairs to work. I sat at my desk and did my job for 8 hours with the particular focus that comes not from the absence of distraction, but from the decision to defer everything that cannot be acted on immediately until the moment it can. I had learned that skill over years of Sunday dinners. Darian came home Thursday evening. Zoe had been in bed for an hour. I had made dinner and left it warm, and I sat across from him at the kitchen table while he ate, and I told him. I did not use the folder as a prop. I had the documents with a D's where they needed to be. I told him from memory, which was accurate, and I watched his face as I spoke. He listened the way he listens to things that cost him something to hear, very still, his fork set down after the first minute, his hands flat on the table. He did not interrupt. He did not deflect or minimize or ask me if I was sure. He let me finish. When I stopped speaking, the kitchen was quiet. "She found the placement agency," he said finally, not to me, more to the middle distance. Before we even started trying, she found it and she made contact. Before we had the conversation, I said. Yes. He looked at me then, and what was in his face was not defensiveness and not the impulse to protect his mother that I had sometimes been on the receiving end of. It was something rawer than that. It was the look of a person who is revising a story they have been living inside. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't. Lionel," his voice was low. "She's my daughter. She has always been my daughter, whatever my mother did or didn't do. I know that." I reached across the table and put my hand on his. "That is not the question. The question is what she is trying to do now." He turned his hand over and held mine. We sat there for a while. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking in the distracted way dogs bark when they're not really alarmed, just noting the existence of the night. Then Darian said, "What do you need from me?" It was the right question. It had always been the right question, and he had not always asked it, and the fact that he asked it now, in this specific moment, mattered in a way I could not have quantified, but which settled something in my chest that had been unsettled for 3 years. "I need you to let me handle this," I said. "My way." "Through a D's," he said, done. The family dinner happened the following Sunday because Renata had scheduled it 6 weeks prior for Claudette's birthday, and because canceling it would have signaled something, and I had decided that I did not want to signal anything until I was ready to signal everything. Darian knew. That was different from before, and it changed the texture of the room in a way that only I could feel. He sat beside me at the table, and he was himself, attentive to his mother, present for Claudette's birthday, nothing in his manner that would have read as off to anyone watching. But twice during the evening he looked at me with a steadiness that I recognized as solidarity, and both times I looked back, and that was sufficient. Claudette was in a good mood, the particular good mood of someone who is the center of attention in a context that requires no conflict. She had turned 61 and seemed genuinely pleased about it. Felix and Cressida were there. Cressida had brought flowers that Renata arranged in a vase and placed in the center of the table, and the flowers were still there when things began to fall apart. Zoe was at the table through the first course, and then, at her own request, and with enthusiastic permission, went to the living room with a tablet and the specific freedom that children accept like a gift without examining it too closely. The shift happened between the main course and dessert. Renata had been, throughout the dinner, subtly repositioning herself in the conversation in a way I recognized as the behavior of someone who is managing the temperature of a room they're afraid is about to change. She was warmer than usual. She complimented the earrings I was wearing. She asked Cressida about her work, which she rarely did. She was performing generosity with the concentration of someone who knows what it is concealing. Claudette, who was not performing anything and who had consumed 2 generous glasses of wine, put down her fork near the end of the main course and looked at me across the table with the unfocused directness of someone who has decided it is the right time for honesty. "I want to ask you something," she said. I put my fork down. "All right. Renata told me about the legal thing." She waved her hand vaguely. "The petition, the trust." She looked at Renata and then back at me. "I just want to understand. Is this going to become something ugly? Because it seems to me like there's a way to handle this that doesn't involve lawyers and courts and all of that." Renata's expression tightened slightly. She had not wanted this brought up at the table. I could see that clearly. Claudette, Renata said, her tone carrying the precise combination of affection and correction that older siblings deploy, this isn't the time. It's fine, I said, before Renata could redirect it further. I looked at Claudette steadily. I think it has already become something that requires the proper process. I don't think a conversation at a dinner table resolves it. Claudette's forehead creased. But why does it have to be adversarial? Renata loves Zoe. Everyone at this table loves Zoe. I let the statement sit for a moment. Felix looked at his plate. Cressida looked at me. I agree, I said, which is why I'm surprised the petition was filed without a conversation with me first. Claudette turned to Renata. Renata picked up her wine glass. I acted in the trust's best interest, she said, as I am authorized to do. Darian set down his fork with a quiet precision that I recognized. Mom, he said, you filed a legal petition that affects my daughter's inheritance standing, without telling me. The table absorbed this. Claudette looked between them. Felix, who I had noted was one of those people who genuinely disliked conflict and had the self-awareness to know it, had found something compelling on the far wall. Renata looked at her son. I told you I had spoken with Franklin about updating the language. Updating the language, Darian said, and filing a petition are not the same thing. I did what needed to be done. Her voice carried the absolute register of someone who has never genuinely considered the possibility of being wrong. Kofi's trust was intended for biological family. That was his intention. I knew him. I knew what he wanted. Darian said very quietly, Zoe is my family. Of course she is. Renata set her glass down. No one is saying otherwise, but the trust is a legal instrument and Kofi's intentions. Did Kofi write those intentions down? I asked. The question landed with the specific weight of a question that already knows its answer. Renata looked at me. He didn't need to write everything down. We were married for 22 years. I knew, because I've read the trust, I said. The original instrument, the one Kofi signed, and I didn't find language about biological children specifically. I found language about lineal descendants and legally recognized heirs. I kept my voice completely even. Zoe is Darian's legally recognized heir. The adoption is final, irrevocable, and predates the petition by 4 years. The dinner table had arrived somewhere none of us had named. Renata's chin lifted. The amendment was added 14 months before the adoption was discussed with me, I said, which is an interesting timeline. Claudette looked at her sister. Whatever she read in Renata's face made her look away. How did you? Renata stopped. Read the documents? I offered. I'm a director-level procurement manager. Reading contracts is what I do. I want to stop here and tell you something. There is a version of this confrontation that is louder. That involves raised voices and chairs pushed back and the kind of theatrical display that makes for dramatic storytelling. That is not what happened. What happened was quieter and in some ways more complete, because what I had was not just feelings. I had 6 years of documentation and an attorney who had filed a counterpetition 48 hours ago and a husband sitting beside me who had said done and meant it. If you are still here, hit like. Because what came next is the part Renata did not see coming. Cressida stood up, quietly, and went to check on Zoe in the living room. I appreciated this more than I said. She was removing my daughter from the room's atmosphere with the instinct of someone who understood what was about to happen. Felix watched her go and then returned his attention to the table with the expression of a man who had decided that bearing witness was the right thing even if it was not comfortable. Claudette said slowly, Renata, what did you do? I administered the trust, Renata said, and the flatness in her voice was the flatness of someone who has decided that the frame of right and wrong does not apply to them, that they are operating in a different register, the register of family authority and historical precedent and a dead husband's presumed intentions. I reached into my bag. I had not brought the folder. Those documents were with Adiz, filed and logged. What I had brought was a printed summary, 4 pages, which Adiz had prepared and which outlined the relevant timeline in the specific clean language of someone who has spent 30 years making arguments that could not be dismissed. I placed it on the table. Renata did not pick it up. She looked at it. What is this? She said. It was not a question. It's a timeline, I said, of the adoption process, the pre-placement contact, the agency communication. The dates of the trust amendment relative to those contacts. I looked at her directly. You were in contact with the placement agency before Darian and I began the process together, before he told me adoption was something he was open to. The initial contact was made by you. The dinner table was very still. Darian, beside me, made a sound that was not a word, just a breath that had something in it. I was trying to help, Renata said. Her voice had shifted. Not to softness exactly, but to the register of explanation, which was already a different register than authority. Darian had told me privately that you were struggling, that he was struggling. I knew people. I made a call, that's all I did. You made a contact with an agency, I said. You began an inquiry. And then 14 months later you had the trust amended to create a discretionary clause about adopted children's inheritance standing. That was a separate decision. It was a sequential decision, I said, by the same person. In the same 14-month window. Claudette was looking at her sister the way you look at someone when you are revising who you thought they were. It was not an easy look to watch. Renata, Claudette said, and her voice had lost its dinner party warmth entirely, did you know who they were going to adopt? Did you know about Zoe before Darian did? Renata's hands were in her lap. I could see them there, below the table's edge, and they were very still, which was the thing that told me the most. I wanted to make sure everything was in order, she said finally. That is all. That is not all, I said. The timeline shows that you were given preliminary information about a potential placement, a specific child, before the agency formally presented the placement to us, before the standard process. I paused. Which means you had information about my daughter before I did. The word "my" landed in the room and did not leave. Darian put his hand on the table, flat, the way he had put it on the kitchen table 4 nights ago. He was looking at his mother with something that I recognized as grief. Not anger first. Grief. The grief of someone who is watching the architecture of a story he loved reveal its actual structure. Mom, he said, did you run Lionel's name through a check? Before we adopted Zoe? The silence that followed this question was the third silence beat, and it was the longest, and in it every person at the table understood something that none of us had fully named out loud. Renata said, I wanted to protect our family. From what? Darian's voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. From Lionel? From a situation where the wrong person had access. She stopped. Reorganized. Kofi's estate is not a small matter. The trust assets are. Are you telling me? Darian said, and he was very careful with each word now, placing them with the deliberateness of a man who knows that what he says in the next 60 seconds will be referred back to for the rest of his life, that you investigated my wife, and that you had information about our daughter before Lionel did, and that you amended the trust to limit Zoe's inheritance, and you filed a petition without telling me. He let that sit. Is that what you're telling me? Renata looked at her son. For the first time since I had known her, she looked uncertain. Not of her position, she had always been certain of her position, uncertain of the outcome, which was different. I am telling you, she said, that everything I have done has been to protect what Kofi built. What we built, I will not apologize for that. It was the wrong answer. I could see Claudette understand that it was the wrong answer. I could see Felix understand it. Renata could not see it, or would not, because she had lived for too long inside a story where her authority was the premise and everything else was detail. I looked at her. I thought about the Sunday dinners and the measured comments and the word developmentally spoken in front of my 3-year-old daughter. I thought about the spring performance and given the family situation. I thought about the folder in the closet and the sealed envelope and Tobias Fenley calling me in a parking garage while my husband was in Columbus. I thought about Zoe asleep in the next room with Cressida sitting nearby, keeping her company, keeping her safe from the temperature of this room. I thought about Darian's hand flat on the kitchen table and the word done. I reached back into my bag. What I placed on the table next was not from a D's summary. It was a copy of a document that I had photographed before I handed over the originals, the pre-placement inquiry form from the folder, the one in Renata's handwriting, the one dated 3 years before our adoption was finalized. The date was written out in Renata's precise script. The agency name was there. And in the field marked relationship to prospective adoptive family, she had written, maternal grandmother, prospective. Prospective. 3 years before Zoe was placed with us. Before Darian and I had a single conversation about adoption, Renata had identified herself as the prospective child's maternal grandmother. She had not been arranging an adoption for her son. She had been arranging a grandchild for herself. Claudette put her hand over her mouth. Felix was very still. Darian picked up the document. He read it. He put it down on the table and he looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked at his mother, and the grief on his face had turned into something else. Not rage, exactly. Clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when the thing you suspected but didn't want to name finally has its name. You selected her, he said. You went to the agency, you identified a child, and then you presented adoption to me as if you were just being supportive. Renata's hands came up from her lap. I opened a door, she said. That is all I did. You walked through it. You both walked through it. Zoe is here. Zoe is loved. What you did, I said, meant that Zoe's adoption was built on a process that I did not consent to and was not disclosed to me. My voice was completely level. I had waited 3 years for this room, and I was not going to perform anything in it. And then you amended the trust to create a mechanism to limit her inheritance. And then, when I started reviewing the trust documents, you filed a petition to formalize that limitation before I could contest it. I looked at her. That is the sequence. Renata looked around the table. At Claudette, who was looking at the flowers Cressida had brought. At Felix, who was looking at me. At Darian, who was looking at her with the clear-eyed grief of a son who is loving his mother and holding her accountable at the same time, which is the hardest thing there is. She found no allies, and in the particular way of people who have never lost before, she reached for the last available tool, which was anger. You have come into this family, she said to me, her voice controlled but carrying, and you have taken my son's attention and his loyalty, and now you are using lawyers and documents and whatever this is to paint me as some kind of villain in front of my own family, in my own house. Her eyes were bright. I have given everything to this family. I raised Darian alone. I kept Kofi's legacy intact. I have been a grandmother to that little girl in there since the day she arrived, and you want to stand here and tell me I'm the problem? The room held. You are the problem, I said, without heat, without performance, without anything except the clarity that comes from having waited long enough to be certain. Not because you love Darian, not because you loved Kofi, not because you love Zoe. I believe all of those things. I looked at her steadily. You are the problem because you decided that love gives you the right to control. And when that control was threatened, you filed a legal petition against my daughter's inheritance without telling her father. That is what you did, not out of malice. Out of the absolute conviction that you are always right and that everyone else's decisions are just yours waiting to be corrected. The room was very still. Claudette stood up. She did not say anything. She walked to the kitchen. I heard the tap run. Felix looked at the table. Darian looked at his mother. Renata sat in the chair at the head of the table where she had sat for every Sunday dinner I had attended in 15 years. And she looked at me. And what was in her face for just a moment, beneath the anger, beneath the authority, beneath the absolute self-certainty that had been her defining characteristic for as long as I had known her, was the look of someone who has won every argument they have ever been in and has just encountered, for the first time, an argument they cannot win. Not because the other person is stronger, because the other person is right. She looked away first. I picked up the printed document. I folded it in thirds with the same precision she used with her dinner service, and I placed it back in my bag. Adiz has filed the counter-petition, I said. Franklin Ibarra's office has been notified of the disclosure issues in the original placement process. The petition will be contested, and based on Adiz's analysis, it will not succeed. I kept my voice at the register of someone reporting information, not winning a fight. But none of that is what I want to talk about. Renata looked back at me. Darian was watching me. I had one more thing to say. What I wanted to talk about was the sealed envelope. Not the pre-placement form, not the trust amendment, not the petition. All of that was Adiz's domain now, and it would be resolved in the correct arena, with the correct process, and the outcome was not something I was uncertain about. What I wanted to talk about was the thing Renata had decided Darian should never see. The envelope that had sat in her closet for 15 years with his name on the front and a conditional note about my signature. The thing that had been sealed before I existed in this family's story and that she had apparently decided should stay that way indefinitely. I looked at Darian. There's one more document, I said. I don't have it with me, it's with Adiz, but I need to tell you what it is before you hear about it through the legal process. He was watching me with full attention. There was a second envelope in the folder, I said. Sealed, your name on the front in your mother's handwriting. Addressed to both of us with a note that my signature was conditional. I paused. I opened it. I had about 90 seconds with it before the police arrived. What I saw was a set of documents from before we met, before we married. Your mother had documentation on a private inquiry, not into adoption, into paternity. The table absorbed this word differently than it had absorbed anything else. Darian turned to look at Renata. Renata's hands came up from her lap again and then stopped, as if she had started to gesture and thought better of it. "You had a paternity inquiry conducted," Darian said. His voice was not loud. It was the specific quiet of a person who is asking a question they have already answered. "Before I married Lionel, I had concerns," Renata said, and the word concerns came out with the thinness of something that knows it is not enough. Claudette had come back from the kitchen at some point. She was standing near the doorway, not at the table. She did not sit back down. "What concerns?" Darian said. Renata looked at the centerpiece, the flowers Cressida had brought. "You had been with other women before Lionel. There was a specific period before you two met when there was a situation I was aware of that you didn't tell me the full story of. I wanted to know if—" She stopped, started again. "I wanted to know that Zoe was fully yours before the adoption was finalized. I had a private test arranged." Darian's face did something complicated that I could not fully read and did not try to. This was his information, his history, his mother's choices in relation to him. I was the narrator of my own story, not his. "You had a private paternity test conducted," he said, "on my daughter without telling me, and you sealed the results and kept them in your closet." Renata lifted her chin. "The results were conclusive. Zoe is yours. I confirmed that." "I was protecting." "Don't say that again." His voice was still quiet, but the quality had changed. There was an edge in it that I had heard perhaps twice in 15 years, and both times it had meant that Darian had reached the end of what he would absorb in silence. "Do not say the word protecting again tonight." Renata looked at her son, and this was the thing I had not seen before in 15 years of Sunday dinners and birthday gatherings, and the particular performance of family togetherness that families perform. She looked genuinely shaken. Not regretful, exactly. Not yet. But shaken, in the way of someone who has just discovered that the ground they built their authority on has a different composition than they believed. She had assumed that love would be the frame through which everything else was interpreted. That the fact of her love for Kofi, for Darian, for Zoe, even in her specific way for the idea of this family, would function as a kind of amnesty. That it would make the controlling behaviors into caution, the petition into protection, the sealed envelope into discretion. What she had not calculated was that a family could receive the love and reject the control at the same time, that these were separable things. Felix looked at me. He had not spoken during the entire confrontation, which was true to his character and which I did not hold against him. He was a man who processed things in private and spoke when he had finished processing, and he had not yet finished. But he looked at me now with an expression that was unambiguous, quiet acknowledgement, the look of someone who has witnessed something and wants the person at the center of it to know they were not invisible. I gave him a small nod. Claudette, from the doorway, said, "Renata, how long have you been sitting on those documents?" Renata did not answer. "How long?" Claudette said, and her voice had the specific weight of a sibling who has deferred for decades and has just elected to stop. "Because if what Lionel is describing is accurate, if you had a paternity test done on Darian's child without his knowledge, and you amended the trust in the same year, and you filed a petition without telling him, then this is not administration. This is not protection. This is—" She stopped and looked at the ceiling briefly, finding the right word. "This is you deciding that you get to manage everyone's life because you lost Kofi and you are terrified of losing anything else." The room was very still. Renata's expression cracked, not into tears, but into something beneath the composure that I had never seen before. Something that looked like it had been under there for a long time, under all the Sunday dinners and the measured assessments and the absolute authority. Something tired. She said, very quietly, "I did lose everything when Kofi died." No one said anything. "I built it back," she said. "I built all of it back. Darian, the house, the trust, the family. I held every piece of it together for years. And then everything started changing and she stopped. Her hands on the table were very still. I didn't know how to change with it. It was the most honest thing she had said in 15 years in my presence. Maybe longer. I sat with it. I let it be what it was, which was true and human and not sufficient. "I know that," I said. "I have always known that." I kept my voice level and without performance. "That is why I am not here to punish you. I am here to tell you that the petition will be defeated, Zoe's standing will be confirmed on the record, and the trust language will be corrected. Not negotiated, corrected. Adiz will be in contact with Franklin Ibarra this week with the specific changes we require." I looked at her directly. "And then I need you to decide what kind of grandmother you want to be." Because the version that controls through legal instruments and sealed envelopes is finished. That is the only version that is finished. Darian looked at me. There was something in his face that I recognized as the specific quality of love that survives being tested, not unchanged, but unbroken. I reached under the table and found his hand and held it. Renata looked at our hands. She looked at the table. She looked at the flowers. After a long moment, she said, "I would like to see Zoe before you leave." Darian looked at me. I said, "We're not leaving yet." Adiz filed the formal counterpetition the following Tuesday, with the pre-placement documentation and the timeline of the trust amendments attached as exhibits. Franklin Ibarra's response came back within 72 hours, and its tone, Adiz told me on the phone, was the tone of an attorney who has had a frank conversation with his client and has communicated to her that the position she has taken is not defensible and that continued pursuit of it will cost significantly more than the concession. The petition was withdrawn 11 days after the dinner. Adiz forwarded me the withdrawal notice on a Thursday morning. The subject line of her email said, "Done." One word. She knew I would understand it. The trust language was formally amended 6 weeks later to confirm Zoe's full inheritance standing as a legally adopted descendant, without conditions and without discretionary carve-outs. The amendment was signed by Renata in her capacity as trustee, with Franklin Ibarra witnessing, and a copy was filed with the probate court and sent to us by registered mail. I put it in the folder with the other documents and put the folder in the locked drawer in my home office, where I kept the things that needed to be kept but did not need to be looked at regularly. Renata did not lose the house. She did not face criminal consequences because what she had done, while deliberate and harmful and a serious breach of Darian's trust, existed in the legal gray space of a trustee making aggressive and arguably improper administrative decisions rather than the commission of a crime. Adiz had been honest with me about this from the beginning, and I had accepted it because what I had wanted was not her destruction. I had wanted the correction. What she lost was different. She lost Claudette's easy deference. Claudette, in the weeks after the dinner, had several private conversations with her sister that I was not party to and which I did not ask about. What I observed was that the dynamic between them shifted. Claudette still visited. She still came to Sunday dinners, which resumed after a month's pause that none of us formally declared. But she sat differently at the table. She engaged differently. The automatic nod was gone. She had her own opinions now, and she expressed them, and Renata received them with the particular adjustment of someone learning, late, that authority requires consent. Felix and Cressida had Darian and me to dinner at their apartment 3 weeks after the confrontation, a quiet weeknight meal that was one of the genuinely good evenings I remember from that period. Felix had finally finished processing. Over the main course, he said, "I should have said something over the years." I watched some of those dinners and he stopped, reorganized. I should have said something. I told him I understood why he hadn't. He had been in a room with Renata, and rooms with Renata had a specific gravity. He accepted this with the seriousness it deserved and then poured more wine and asked Zoe, who had come with us, what she was currently interested in, and she told him with great authority that she was interested in frogs, specifically tree frogs, and the conversation moved on to tree frogs and stayed there, which was exactly right. Ingrid and I brought on 2 additional clients in the 6 months after the dinner, which brought the practice's annual revenue to a number I had not projected reaching for another 18 months. The work was good. I was good at it. I had known both of these things for years and had simply been patient about their becoming visible. Darian and his mother are rebuilding something. I will tell you honestly that I don't know what shape it will take when it's finished. I know that he calls her on Sundays. I know that she came to Zoe's birthday party in February and sat at the kitchen table and ate cake and watched Zoe run around with her school friends with the open, unguarded look I had first seen in the hospital, the one that was pure love without calculation. I know that at one point during the party Zoe climbed into her grandmother's lap for approximately 45 seconds before climbing back out to return to her friends, which is exactly the attention span a 6-year-old allocates to grandmothers at birthday parties, and that Renata held her for those 45 seconds with everything she had. I did not interfere with that. I was not going to interfere with that. Zoe is, for the record, doing beautifully. Her language development remains in the 85th percentile. She can identify 4 species of tree frog by sight and is working on a 5th. She starts first grade in September and has already identified which of her kindergarten friends she intends to sit near, contingent on the seating chart being amenable to negotiation. I have told her that seating charts are not typically subject to negotiation. She has told me she will see about that. She is entirely herself. She has been entirely herself since the day she arrived. No document, no petition, no sealed envelope in a closet has ever changed that or could. I think about the folder sometimes. Not the trust documents, those are resolved. I think about the moment Zoe came running into the kitchen with it held over her head like a trophy, completely unaware of what she was carrying, offering it to me with the uncomplicated generosity of someone who shares everything they find, because they have not yet learned that some things are better kept hidden. She gave me the thing that ended the waiting. She didn't know that. She was building a fort. I am not at peace with everything that happened over those 15 years, but I am clear on it, which is a different thing and in some ways better. Clarity is something you can work with. Peace is something you wait for. I have stopped waiting. My mother says I should have handled it privately, without attorneys, and that what I did was adversarial and unnecessary. Darian's Aunt Claudette says I waited too long and should have moved sooner. Renata has said nothing to me directly about any of it, which I take as its own kind of answer. Here is what I want to know from you. A woman who loves her family conducted a paternity test on her son's child without telling him, amended a legal trust to limit that child's inheritance, and filed a petition in court, all in private, all without disclosure. I built a legal case and forced a correction through the proper process. I did not go to the press. I did not end the family. I drew a line and I held it. Did I go too far, or not far enough? Tell me in the comments.